we need to figure out what a real, quote-unquote, real amp actually sounds like, or what the typical characteristics of a real amp are, and then how to get these characteristics, or how to get the sims, if they're lacking, to sound like a real amp. This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hein, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello. I'm great. Thank you. I am currently on beautiful Vancouver Island, but there is smoke everywhere. There's like forest fires going down in the States real close by and a couple on the island, and it's just like, it looks like a foggy November day.
Yeah, like we were talking about that. I can hardly imagine how that is because I've never experienced something like that. Thankfully.
It's so weird. Like, it'll be the middle of the day, but it's still just looks like it's just gray everywhere. You can't see anything, and the sun is like red, and it's like the end of the world.
Are there like warnings to stay inside if it's getting too bad or stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, like actually this is a pretty bad one. The air quality is terrible. Some of the worst that it's like ever been in my life anyways. So stay inside.
How, just for people and for myself, so that we can understand this, how far away from the actual like crazy fires are you?
Really far. I mean, I don't know. Let's see. Forest fires map. Sure, I'll find something. Current wildfire activity, interactive map. Here we go. Thank God for the internet. I mean, like there's some on the island that are really close. Like an hour drive, if even that. But this doesn't show the ones in the States. Okay, so I didn't find a good map. So I'm not really actually like sure where the fire is happening in the States, other than that it's kind of a lot of places, I think, because the fire's pretty out of control down there.
But it's at least a couple of hours then, right? So.
Oh yeah, easy. The fire, the smoke can travel really, really far.
But it's like the fact alone that it's like hours away and it's still like really affecting the air quality where you are. It's kind of crazy. So.
Yeah, it is very, very crazy.
Yeah, I mean, but there's like a water gap between you and the States, right? So
yes, we're safe in that regard, thankfully.
Yeah. Oh shit.
Okay, yeah. I found a little map, and oh yeah, wow, it is not good down there. Holy cow! All right, sending out good vibes to Washington.
Yeah,
hopefully they get that under control.
Washington, California, Oregon also affected.
Yeah, it's like the whole western side of the U.S. is on fire, it looks like on this map anyways. Holy cow. If you're listening from there, sending you our best wishes.
Yeah, totally. Well, yeah, there's nothing we can do other than that, unfortunately. It's like, yeah, it's kind of crazy for us Europeans especially, because we don't have things like that often, if at all. And like it seems like something I can't even imagine. So, yeah. Anyway, other than that, I hope you're feeling great. You had a great weekend.
Yep. Yeah, things are good. We're gonna be doing a whole bunch of mixing this week, so I'm stoked.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, today's episode is a thing that we are we are answering again a pretty common popular question that I got a couple of times. Like during the last weeks or months, so people have been emailing about this and mentioning it, I think also in the community, in the Facebook community, and that is, they want to know how to make amp sims or stuff like the Kemper or XFX sound more real or feel more real, like a real amp. So it seems like people really struggle with this, or they feel like that amp sims sound flat or like two-dimensional compared to a real amp, and they want to know what to do about this. And since this seems to be such a popular topic, and I put some thought into it, and we've been talking about this before the episode, and we came up with a couple of things to help you with that problem if you have that, and because we think there could be some reasons for that that are pretty easy to tackle, and that's what we're going to talk about. Make your amp sims sound more real, feel more real, so that you don't feel like you're using an artificial amp anymore.
it shouldn't be that way. There amp sims, amp modelers like the Kemper or Axfx and stuff like that. They are more than capable of doing a very professional job. And if you don't think that's true, you are mistaken.
Totally.
They've been prevalent and being used on tons of hit songs for a long time now. It's not even a question if they are up to the task anymore. They just totally are. So if you're not getting those results, that's something we need to figure out what you're doing wrong.
Totally. And that's why it's so hard for me to describe the episode or to come up with a title even, because we don't want to imply that amp sims are not as good or not as real sounding, because they are. It's most likely it's the way you're using it that's causing the problem and not the amp sim or the Kemper itself. And that's why it's kind of hard to find a good title for this. But I can see that there is a problem. And I totally believe that there's an issue if people are emailing about that. So you can't argue with how people feel about using those things. And so that's why we decided to do that. And I think to be able to really do this and to find the issue and solve it, we need to figure out why you are feeling that way, or why people think that amp sims sound digital or not real. We need to figure out what a real, quote unquote, real amp actually sounds like, or what the typical characteristics of a real amp are, and then how to get these characteristics, or how to get the sims, if they're lacking, to sound like a real amp. So It's a step-by-step process again in this episode. And let's jump in. So,
all right,
Malcolm, what's your thoughts on this? Why do you think that people still believe like amp sims are not a professional thing to use, or don't sound as good as real amps?
Okay, I do have a theory on this, and I think it all comes down to what they're hearing when they try them out. Because you plug into an amp sim and you're hearing it out of whatever your studio monitoring setup is. And if that's not super awesome, you just got some cheap laptop speakers or something like that, it's not going to sound very impressive to you. What you're hearing isn't going to sound very impressive. But if you plug in the Marshall stack sitting beside your desk and have like 100 watts of speakers blasting you, you're gonna perceive that to sound way better, right?
Totally, yeah. But go ahead.
But that what you're hearing for the amp sim in that situation, if you're listening to it on your laptop speakers or whatever, isn't what that sounds like. It's just what you're hearing. That's your monitoring setup that is flawed in that case. So I don't think sometimes that they're shot out in a realistic way that actually portrays what they sound like compared to each other.
That's a super good point. I haven't even thought about this, but you're totally right. And maybe, or pretty likely, it's the issue that people have with amp sims might be the same issue that they have when they ask the almost just as popular question of, why does my recorded real guitar amp, why does that not sound like the amp in the room when I'm standing in front of it? It's like a different question, but basically the same reason. So they have the stack, then they mic it up, then they listen through it through their headphones or through their monitors or whatever, and then they feel like it's not the same like what they heard in the room. So this might be just the same issue as the one with the amp sims, because you're not comparing the feeling you have. You are comparing the feeling you have when you're standing in front of an amp with what comes out of your monitors. That's very interesting, and you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, so until you mic up that amp and compare it through the same medium that you're using to listen to the amp sim, you can't really do an accurate comparison, right? They have to be back to back through the same audible. So miking up the amp and then listening to it through those same speakers would be a great way to do that.
Totally. And by the way, usually I say these things at the end of the episode, but this time, as this is I feel like a very objective or subjective topic, and I feel like there are different opinions, a lot of strong opinions on this, because some people swear by amp sims, others hate them. We're curious to know how you feel about this. So in case you're not listening to the very end of the episode and miss it, I want to point you to the Facebook community, and I want to say, please join that community and let us know how you feel about this, and maybe let us know if you are struggling with the same thing, or if you have found solutions for this, or if you have a theory on why that is. So just go to the selfrecordingband.com/community and join the conversation there. and let us know, because this is an interesting topic and one that will get even more important, because I feel like more and more people are starting to use amp sims and similar things like Kemper or XFXs, just because they sound so good and just because it's just more convenient to use them. And the tools we have now are just different from what we had a couple of years ago. So this is an ongoing, ever-evolving topic, and we're curious to hear your thoughts on this. So join the Facebook community and let us know. I just wanted to say that.
Awesome. Love it.
Yeah. So the problem of comparing the real thing to what comes out of your speakers, that's one thing. I feel like also just the fact that it's digital and that you are turning virtual knobs on a plugin or like at this computer, like this futuristic sounding Kemper device or whatever you're using, I feel that alone might add to the impression that it's kind of artificial or fake or not real, just because it is not real. But you know what I mean? So people like turning knobs. It's the same with like analog recording gear. So much of that is just how you feel about using it, if you can actually touch it or if you have to use your mouse. And so there's a bias, I think, towards like analog circuits and knobs and stuff.
Right. Yeah.
That definitely, I think, plays a role here.
Yeah, it's potentially not as fun to use.
Yeah, exactly. And there are two camps. Some people like that. Some people prefer that. There are these like computer people, or especially the younger people, I think, who like start out using amp sims. They don't have that problem as much. But as like someone who is like really used to their amps, maybe spent a lot of money on their amps, and where like these amps are really valuable to them, they know how they sound, and it's hard to accept that $100 plugin can do the same thing as your like vintage Marshall or Mesa or whatever you have. So it kind of hurts a bit to admit that may be also part of the story.
Yeah, I really like that you said maybe spent a lot on their amp.
Yeah.
I think that is more than likely. There's the sunk cost fallacy where you've invested in it already, so now you have to use it. Otherwise, you feel like you're losing money, like you wasted your money. But either way, you already spent the money on the amp, so you're stuck.
Totally. And I know that feeling as well, even though I know that these amp sims really can sound as good like as a real amp. I sometimes, especially in the beginning, I sometimes felt guilty when I was mixing stuff and I had to reamp stuff, and I was using a plugin instead of the real amps that I have here in the studio and the real like the reamping box that I have and the analog gear and all the nice preamps and mics and stuff. Not using that and going for a plugin always felt like lazy, or it's almost like I owed it to the client to use the real stuff. Although I knew that the plugin was the better decision in that case, but it felt a little weird.
Because you just have to remember that it's all about the results, not the process. So
yeah, exactly. But all that said, I think there are still some flaws and problems that some amp sims have, but there are ways to compensate for that, and we want to talk about those as well. And we kind of divide this into two camps. So there's the hardware modelers, or like the profiling approach of the Kemper, versus the actual amp sims, which are two different things. Malcolm, you have more experience with the Kemper. I use plugins a lot, so we can talk about this a little. Yeah, let's start. Do you feel like the Kemper has something, if you're capturing a profile of a real amp, because that's what the Kemper does. The Kemper is not an amp sim in that it's an algorithm that tries to be an amp, but it like captures a real scenario and tries to reproduce it accurately. That's what a Kemper does. But do you feel, if you're doing like A/B comparisons, that there is a big enough difference to be worried about? Or do you feel like this A/B comparison even makes sense? Do you even need to do that?
I don't. I think it's awesome, man. Like I'm just constantly blown away by this. It was easily like the best investment I've ever made in a piece of gear, without a doubt. I love it way too much. I'm such a fanboy. So I think it sounds killer. I think the misconception that people most commonly have, and that maybe I had at the beginning, was that it was going to put every amp in the world at my fingertips, and it's not that. So if there's a flaw in the design, I mean, I wouldn't call it a flaw because it's not meant to do that, but like that's where it feels like you don't have that power. So I can't just like grab the treble or like the cutoff and expect it to sound like a Vox AC30's cutoff. You know, it's not that. I don't have all the knobs of every amp in front of me, but I do have a capture of that amp in a specific room with a specific mic and a specific like amp chain, essentially, kind of thing. So you have to look at it differently. in how you perceive what the tool is. Once you are looking at it as it was intended, as these snapshots of different setups, not an amp in front of you, just snapshots of certain situations with those amps, I think it performs perfectly.
Yeah, I agree. That's really the misconception here. You can't expect to dial in mids on the Kemper and expect it to be what reaching for the mid knob on a Marshall does, because as we all know, the Marshall EQ doesn't do anything. So you can it doesn't matter where the Marshall EQ is. It's compared to other amps at least. But the Kemper is its own EQ that's baked into the device, and it's not what the real EQ is. But people think some people think that this is what it does. So you're right here. I agree.
Right, but it does bring up the good point in that there is a learning how to use your gear, and be that a Kemper. With my Kemper, I've learned how to get the results. If I want more mids, or the mids to kind of be shaped differently on that profile, I have to find ways to do that, So you do learn how to manipulate the gear in front of you. And I'm sure, that is the same with these amp sims. You learn ways to get them to do what you expect them to do.
Yeah, agreed. There are two main issues for me with the Kemper, at least. From my experience with it, I used to have one as well. Twice, actually. I had one, I sold it. I bought one again, and I sold it again. But I liked it. I still liked it. It's just that I was using more and more plugins, and that was better for my workflow and everything, but I still liked it. But I think there are two, or at least to me, there were two flaws or issues that I had with it. Not really flaws, but two issues that I had with it. One was to be able to really match it perfectly, or to have control over the way it feels rather than the sound, but just the way it feels when you play it. I always had to dive into the menu a bit and dial in or play with the stuff that's not as obvious. So it's not the EQ that you see, it's not just the gain, but it's what's under the hood that you can manipulate with the Kemper. And if you play with that, experiment with that, and get it what it actually does, you can get so close, or you can get it perfectly, basically. But I always felt like I had to play around with this, and I never really got it entirely. Or I feel like that for many people, that they didn't spend enough time with it to really get it to the point where it's perfect, to the sweet spot. So that's one issue kind of that I had with it. Just the way that the workflow is and the menus, and that you have to dial in all these things. And the other thing for me, and I'm curious if you have the same experience, the other thing for me was I always had to use it with a plugin anyway, because I had to use it with IRs most of the time, because I really didn't like the way the caps sound in the Kemper. I always felt like no matter the chain, no matter the profile, especially for distorted stuff, there always was this subtle layer of fizz over everything. With cleans, I didn't have that issue. I loved the cleans on the Kemper, absolutely. But with high gain stuff especially, I felt like there was always this layer of fizz. And I always had to use external IRs with it to get that right. I don't know if you have the same issue, but that's what I was constantly running into. It was the same sound, but with that added kind of white noise thing on top of it.
So I've been experimenting with the IRs from your suggestion, actually. Yeah. And I do think it sounds great doing that. But I haven't really found it to be worth the hassle yet.
Okay.
And I've got kind of two things for that. I think there is a quality of profile that you use in a Kemper that's really important, right? An IR, improving the IR on a bad one, makes a huge difference. It's ridiculous. But some of them are just great captures, and you're going to be fine either way. And then the other thing is that I just don't do that much super high gain guitar tones. So I don't think I'm running into that problem as much. I'm primarily in rock, which is cleaner than you'd think as far as guitar tones go. And it hasn't really been a problem. But that IR trick is totally worth using and knowing how to do as well.
Yeah, I think it might be a high gain issue, really. But that's what I always had with the Kemper, and it was kind of frustrating because I wish it would just give me the tone out of the box, ready to go, and I always had to run into a plugin or some IR loader or anything like that. So that was basically it, and I don't know. And then there's something that hasn't been solved for me quite yet. I was discussing this with a couple of people, and I got totally different opinions on this, and that is the DI quality of the Kemper. Like if you record if you split the signal and you record the processed signal of the Kemper and you also record the clean DI in case you want to reamp later.
Yep.
I'm in the there are two camps basically. I'm on in the camp that doesn't like how the Kemper DI sounds, but there are people who say it's totally fine and they love how it sounds. I always felt that the DI out of the Kemper, even if you patch it, that it's just the through without any processing, didn't sound like the DI. It sounded a little processed. It sounded a little weird. I just didn't like the way the DI sounded. I don't know.
I run a DI in front of the Kemper.
Yeah, that's
for
what
sure.
I did.
It's fine. It'll capture a DI, but I have a radial active DI that kicks its ass for sure. And so I use that in front of it for sure every time.
Okay, cool.
Definitely with you on that. For sure. I did want to add that I could be wrong on this, but I think they've built in an IR loader into the Kemper's app now. And this is probably new for you as well, but there is a computer app for Kempers now. Like you run your Kemper from the computer, not the amp, if you want to.
But not like a plugin. You still need the Kemper. You just control it from the computer.
Oh yes, it's just a controller. But I believe they've built in an IR loader. I haven't actually downloaded it yet, so I can't really verify that. But
awesome. I'm just saying all these things because that's a totally different topic actually. But I'm just saying these things because I want to get to the core, the issues that could be behind all this. And so we have the fizz thing because we're going to talk about that later. That's also an issue with some of the amp sim plugins. Then we have the DI quality, which also always plays a role. Like if you are, maybe it's not the Kemper that's wrong, but maybe you are recording the clean DI through the Kemper and then you're reamping later and then it maybe is a little wrong or weird.
Yeah.
So the DI quality is very important. The IR is super important. This fizz problem is a problem with many amp sims. So I just want to get to those issues and then find ways to compensate for those. And then I think,
that's
go on.
Well, that's great because I don't really use amp sims and kind of for similar reasons. Like I find there's a fizz problem often in the ones that I've tried, especially on the high gain stuff.
Yeah.
And then it's the getting it to feel like an amp, right? Where I don't find that I've managed to make it respond like an amp like I want it to. So we're kind of coming at it from the same issues, but we use different solutions and different products to get there. So this is perfect. We're going to kind of both learn how we can overcome those.
Absolutely. So we need to find out what makes an amp sound real, and we need to find out what issues there are, what the potential issues there are with amp sims. The potential issues are, as we said, the fizz. It could be in front of the amp sim, the problems, like the DI. It could be the IR, because the cab or the IR are just so important, even more important than the amps sometimes. And then, there is one thing that is, at least to me, that plays a big role in how an amp feels, or how, if an amp feels real, and that is the sense of air being moved. That's what I always call it, the sensation of the speakers are moving and the guitar jumps out of the speakers. This is what I would call a three-dimensional sound versus this flat sound that could be perfect, from the frequency. If you're talking about frequency response, could be perfect. The dynamics could be perfect. So if you hit the strings softly or if you hit them hard, you have differences in distortion. Even that could be perfect, but still it could sound kind of two-dimensional if you don't get that oomph, this the speaker movement, Yeah. And that could be part of the problem. I think that's part of what we perceive as a real amp. It was what a real amp does. And there are ways to compensate for that. So what do you do if you have small monitors or headphones, the typical recording scenario at home, and you don't get that sensation? You just don't feel like you have this loud amp in front of you. What do you do to make that happen?
I mean, this is going to be a better question for you to answer because, I guess I don't really have that problem.
Okay.
Neither do you. We both have amazing studio monitors.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I feel like still, to me, for people to make it more enjoyable or to get this sensation of a real amp, I think they should try, and that goes against what many people will tell you, but I believe in this. I think you should try playing around with an EQ after the amp sim, and it could be just in your listening chains, or maybe it could be just a plugin on your channel that you disable later, but just while you play, so to make it more fun, to make it feel more real, you could just find the spot in the low end where where you have this full body and speaker movement and this oomph that happens when you do palm mutes and stuff. It can be too much in the mix later, so don't worry about that right now. But if you just find that spot where you get that, where the guitar jumps at you when you do that, and just boost that a little while you play, and like increase the volume also a bit, and maybe have like the frequency response a little weird, not what you want to have later in the mix, but just while you play, I feel like that is more fun, and I feel like that feels more like what you have when you stand in front of an actual amp. And I sometimes do that when someone's next to me and they say they just don't feel it, and they wanna, like, they say they don't hear the guitar, but it's actually pretty loud, but still they somehow just don't feel it. I sometimes do that. I just crank 180 or 200 or something like this, just on the listening side, and all of a sudden it feels more fat and real to them.
That's great, because that really highlights one of like the main primary massive advantages of amp sims, and it's that you can do that and it's not changing what you record at all.
Yeah.
You can just then turn down that bass after the fact, after they've recorded, and you can do whatever you want to it. It hasn't been recorded that way. So huge advantage to amp sims right there, because if you do that on a Marshall, it's going to actually track that way, and you'd have to then reamp to eliminate that. So way more time consuming.
Yeah.
Definitely dig that. And now, were you talking I guess you were talking about, turning up like the bass on the amp sim, but both. What about the positioning in the room? Because you could also find some spots, especially if you're not running the computer, where it actually sounds bassier in the room. And just tip on that, head to the back wall. It'll probably be right against it.
Absolutely. I have this couch behind me, the sofa behind me, and when you sit there, it's really, you have this crazy low end that I wouldn't want to hear when I'm mixing or judging like sounds, but it sounds impressive. And so I always tell people, like, go back there, sit there, and play there, because it's a wise thing to do anyways, to move away from the computer screen and the monitors and the computer, because you get less interference, less noise issues. And B, you have exactly what you just described. You have a spot in the room with this exaggerated big low end, and it's immediately more fun to play if you're sitting there. You can also combine that with headphones. You can like have headphones on so you really hear all the details, but still have the monitors in the room really loud to just get the feeling, like the low end. And what it all comes down to is you just have to create an environment and a monitoring situation that is as close as possible to what you're used to when you're standing in front of an amp. That's basically what we're talking about. And usually that's more low end than what is going to end up being on the record. That's one thing. It has to do with volume. And you just got to make it fun. I think that's really it. That's half the battle, actually. If it's fun to play, if it's loud, if it's fat, if it has low end, you immediately feel better compared to tiny speakers, low volume, less low end.
Yes.
Just not as fun.
Now, this is actually at the bottom of our list because I wrote it right before we started, but I think it should be discussed now. And it's the idea that the guitar tone isn't just made up from the guitar. It's made up from all the other instruments in the mix as well. So drums and bass in particular add a lot to what we perceive as the guitar sound, especially the bass guitar. Without a bass guitar and a good bass guitar, your guitar sounds pretty wimpy. So if you're not used to hearing what that actually sounds like, you might kind of feel like your amp sim is just like weak, right? But maybe it's fine. It just doesn't have a big bass guitar backing it up, right? So there's a little bit of experience that goes into it, just knowing what an isolated guitar sound might sound like. But I think this kind of ties into what you're saying right now, Benny, in that if you're recording guitar before bass, which Benny recommends, and you don't have that bass to like feel good, you have to compensate on the amp sim. You have to crank up that low end and make things just sound overly big, right? And it's going to help with your perception there.
Oh yeah, totally. That could be part of the problem, actually. If you're tracking without a bass, sometimes I do like a bass scratch track, or I program bass to do not run into that issue. But it's true, if you're tracking without the bass track with just 2 drums, it could sound weaker than it actually is in the final production. Yeah, that could be part of the problem. Totally.
Definitely.
Other than that, sometimes these amp sims really have that issue. It's just oftentimes it's just a matter of the monitoring and the listening chain. But some amp sims really sound a little 2-dimensional or flat. It can be the case, and if that's the case, also this little subtle low end boost that you can do. It can be done in mixing. It can be done if you commit to it during tracking. But just finding the spot in the frequency spectrum where like the speaker movement really is. And increasing that just a little bit, boosting that a little bit, can make something that sounds a little flat sound more exciting and more 3-dimensional. So I've done that in the past quite often. Not as often. I've done it more often than with real amps, to be honest. So I think there might be an issue with some amp sims here that I just feel it sounds somewhat flat, and I want to add this sensation of air being moved. So if that's an issue with what you're using, just do a subtle boost, like 2 dB or something at around 200, 150, something that would, depending on the tuning and everything. But that can really make the guitars jump out a little more, especially during palm mutes. So that's one trick that I really use quite a bit, actually.
Cool.
I sometimes cut above that to not make it boxy or muddy, but like just a tiny, narrow boost around this area really helps it a lot. It helps a lot for me. So
Yeah, I like that idea a lot.
okay, another common issue is the fizz. We've already talked about this, that this could be a problem. I don't know technically why that happens, but it is a problem. And what it ultimately comes down to is what I've already said in another episode, that the cab is so important. Same with real amps, with like analog amps and cabs. The cab is super important. And an IR is just a virtual cab, or sometimes it's not an IR, sometimes it's just a filter curve or some speaker simulation built into an amp sim. And depending on what those sound like and what those look like, it could be a little weird. It could not be what an actual real cab does, and what the air does that the sound needs to travel through before it hits a microphone and all that stuff. So it could be an additional layer of fizz there, of high end that would be filtered in a real life scenario. So yeah, that is an issue with some sims. Now the problem is, what many people do is they use a high cut or a low pass and just filter the top end until it's not fizzy anymore. I don't like that at all, most of the time at least, because that always sounds kind of filtered for me. There's this weird resonance then around where the filter is. And then also, I don't know, it feels kind of dull. I like the open sound of not using a high pass filter. So I sometimes, if I can't use another IR, or if I can't solve the problem that way, I just notch out those high hissy, fizzy frequencies. But usually I've tried to find an IR that just works, because there are some that work. And that's why that's the point that I'm trying to get across here, is just play around with the IRs. If you have an amp sim that lets you turn off the speaker simulation, just try that. Get a third-party IR loader. There are free ones that are great. Get a bunch of IRs. They are cheap. There are free ones as well. And just play around with those and see what a difference those make, because it's a really, really big difference. And your fizz problems might be gone. Sometimes it's just the built-in cabs that do this. The amp might sound great, but it's just the cabs. I've told the story before that I've worked with a band who used a almost 20-year-old pod software, like the Line 6 pod thing. And I always thought this is just a terrible amp sim. But when you use that with great IRs, even that old thing can sound really, really cool. So yeah,
I think that's been one of the biggest kind of leaps in amp sims, is been the like realization of how much a good IR changes things. That fizz used to be more of an issue than it is now, I think, as well, with modern amp sims. Like amp sims have more than doubled in their quality in the last 10 years. They're so much further, and I'm really wanting to grab a couple of the newer ones that have come out, because I'm seeing the results in songs I'm hearing that I just can't believe that they recorded that without any gear. You know, they just went direct into an interface and ran it through that plugin, and it sounds amazing. So yeah. But I think the main thing that you need to just remember is that there's no reason to not solve that fizz. It is solvable. So in the case of a Kemper, I'm normally just reaching for a different profile until I find something that doesn't have a fizz that's annoying me. That's really like my solution there. That and the guitar. I think the guitar because the guitar is going to interact with each profile, in my case, differently, right? So with amp sims, that might just mean trying out a couple different amp sims or different amps inside of the sim. But then the almost all of the decent amp sims these days have IR loaders or like cab options, I would say at least. And if you can turn it off, great, and load up some other ones. There's always a solution.
Totally. And if you don't know what IRs are, by the way, a very quick explanation. IR stands for impulse response, and it's a snapshot. It's a capture, just like the Kemper profile, basically. It's a snapshot, a capture of a cab and a microphone and the recording chain behind it. So if you turn the speaker simulation off on your amp sim, what you're left with is the head without a cap. And it sounds super fizzy, of course. It doesn't have the filter, but it goes all the way up and it sounds very weird. And if you put a cap behind that, a natural guitar cap has this high-end roll-off. So it just goes until 6, 7, 8K, something like that, and then it rolls off pretty steep. And an IR is just a capture of that. It does the same thing. You can use a filter curve that's instead of an IR. There are various ways to do this, but IRs are not only the filter curve, they are the microphone, the microphone positioning, the preamp that's being used, like the whole chain. It's just a snapshot of the recording chain, basically. So you can have your amp sim, and then you can switch between different caps and microphone setups. And depending on how well those are done, you have the fizz or you don't have it as much. And that's basically it. And it really changes the whole situation, changes everything almost. So,
yeah, very important.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so IRs and fizz. I think the fizz problem mostly comes down to IRs, so that's why I threw those. Like, why that I try to answer the fizz question with the IR answer. Another thing is, I think what makes a good real amp is how dynamic it is and how it feels when you play it, so how it reacts to your playing. That's what many people complain about as well with Kempers or amp sims. They say like, especially with amp sims with plugins, they say like it doesn't react like their real amp.
Right.
And I have a theory on this as well, and I believe that it comes down to gain staging. I believe that many people run a signal into the amp sim that is just too hot maybe. So even if they pick lightly, it's just not as clean as they're used to from their amp. It's just always distorting. And when they hit harder, it still distorts, but it gets maybe a little muddier, but it's not as dynamic. So what you need to understand is when you plug into a real amp, you have the volume on your guitar, and then you have the gain on the amp, the preamp, and then you have the master out maybe, depending on the amp that you're using. And that's it. And maybe you have pedals in front of it, but you have your rig. If you are playing into your interface and using a plugin, you have an additional gain control, and that is the preamp of your interface. And it does matter where, like, how you set this. It's not, it has to be right. The gain staging has to be right, because you can use that, you can abuse that, just like you can use a booster in front of your amp that will overdrive the amp if you use it. You can use your preamp gain. If you crank that, you will send a lot of level in the amp, and the amp will not react the way it would when you plug the guitar right in. Or you can run a very quiet signal into the amp, and it will also sound different, and you will find yourself having to crank the amp more than you're used to in the real world. So you have this additional point of this additional gain stage that you need to control. And it's super important to remember that. And that, I feel like that's the issue for many people, that they don't really understand gain staging, and that they don't record a level that simulates the actual guitar level that goes into a real amp.
Yeah, that's huge. That could be one of the most important things to take away from this episode, is that the level you send into the amp sim is going to change the guitar tone hugely. And people do this with real amps all the time without realizing it. They stick on a boost pedal and they're like, oh, like that got fat. And it's like, well, now you're hitting your amp harder. It's distorting more. It has less dynamic range, right? And that's going to change things. So it's something you may already be doing without realizing it. But you can do that with amp sims, especially because of this extra preamp. And Kempers, to touch on that briefly, I kind of think that a a Kemper just feels like a different amp. Once you get used to it, you start playing it like it's its own amp. And the different profiles don't really change how that amp feels that much. But like you kind of alluded to earlier, there are some controls under the hood, like sag and stuff like that you can go into and customize to try and get it to respond differently. But that's too much to get into on this episode. Just suffice to say, if you have a Kemper, you should totally go digging into that stuff and learn how to use it.
Yes, totally. And you don't have that control with most amp sims. There are some that give you more control, but most you don't. You cannot control what's under the hood. So you need to get this right. You need to get the gain staging right. Yeah, that's basically it. Some amp sims like the STL Tone Hub that I'm enjoying very much right now. Mm-hmm. They have some additional controls that you might be used to from some real amps. So they have this overall resonance control, for example. That does basically what I said with the low end boost. If you crank that, you get this additional low end, but it's not like an EQ. It's just this oomph. I don't know how to explain it. This low end that you feel more than you hear it, and this depth that you get. Some amps are like there are some real amps with a depth control, especially in the high end. Like the high end amps do have a depth control or resonance, it's called sometimes. And the STL Tone Hub plugin has this global resonance control. And that is super cool. And I find when I don't use that, when that's all turned all to the left, it sounds a little flat. And once I start dialing that in, or sometimes even like really cranking it, it gives me the realism and the way I want an amp to react. So
cool.
Yeah, some amp sims give you some control over this, but it's mostly gain staging. Yeah, but if you have a depth or resonance control, try playing with that. It's the opposite of or not the opposite, but maybe you know what I mean if I explain it that way. The opposite of what a presence knob does. The presence knob gives you these harmonics and this top band without having to dial in highs. It makes it clearer, makes it more present, makes it more open. The same thing in the low end does the resonance knob or the depth knob. So yeah.
Right.
All right, so gain staging. That brings us to another issue that I think people might have, and that is if you're used to recording with an interface and not with a real amp, you might not pay as much attention to what's in front of it, maybe. So cables, the quality of the DI itself, because if you plug into an amp, it's just your guitar and then you have the amp input, but your interface might just change the DI signal. It gets converted, it has the mic preamp or the instrument preamp. So what you're sending into the amp sim doesn't need to be the exact same thing, is not necessarily the exact same thing that you would send into a real amp. So the quality of your DI and the cable you're using and everything before the actual amp sim plays a huge part as well. So
yeah. I mean, you wrote down DI quality and then I wrote down short cable runs, but they're kind of the same thing because the one affects the other. So I encourage people to use short cables. Pretty much the shorter the cable, the less signal loss you're going to have. It's going to be a stronger signal. And there's the kind of buffers and gear you can get to improve that. And then the next thing would be to run that into a high quality DI as well, which we've already mentioned in this episode. But the high quality external DI is almost always going to be better than whatever's built into your interface. I mean, technically, if you have one, you should shoot up both and see what you think. But you'll probably find that you've got a stronger, more full signal, DI capture, if you use a high-quality external DI.
Totally.
Do you have a favorite DI, Benny?
Yes, I have. The Countryman Type 85 is a classic, and it's just really, really great. I love it. I also like the Little Labs, what is it called? Red Eye?
Yeah.
I don't have this one, but I have used it a couple of times, and I've always found it really great. But I also had great success just with the radial ones. But I have to be careful here. There's one radial one that I absolutely don't like because the impedance is not high enough to make it really work as a DI. Weirdly enough, it shouldn't be called a DI actually. But that's another thing here. But most of the radial pro ones, the more expensive ones, always sound great. And interestingly, we did some shootouts within the Academy beta students that are going through my course beta version, and some of them bought DIs after I've recommended it to them, and they shot out their interface preamps and DIs with the DI boxes, and we got very different results. So some of them had some of them had results where it was absolutely clear that the DI is better. But I remember one particularly where the person doing the shootout compared, I think, a Palmer DI that I actually like and recommend because it's a budget cheap DI that is great. He compared that to his Behringer interface, the cheapest one they have. And he sent the results to me, and I did a blind test, and it was very hard, very, very, very hard to tell which is which. So that cheap interface did a great job with the DI. But you have to shoot it out to know that. Like, there can be surprises. Just in this case, I would totally be fine using that interface as DI, although it was a very cheap one. So you never know.
Yeah, just don't make an assumption that your expensive interface has good DIs because that might be where they saved the money. You have to just, until you experiment, you really don't know.
Yeah.
I got it's a Radial X amp, or no, that is the name of the reamp box, but it's like the equivalent model, active DI. And I used to have, I still have the green JDI Pro, which is a great passive DI. But until I got that active one, I didn't really know what I was missing. It was just like, oh, my guitar tone just got 15% better. There we go.
Yeah, totally. Unless that is, and that's why you don't, you don't do as much heavy stuff, because where the active DI boxes fall short is when you use active pickups with a lot of output. They tend to clip. They don't have the headroom. You need a great passive one for that application.
Yeah, which is when I would go back to the green.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, definitely. I've on my wall, I've just a bunch of Les Pauls and Telecasters and stuff. So it's all these passive pickups. And getting an active DI box was a great move.
Totally. Yeah, so the whole chain before the interface just makes so much of a difference. And that could be totally where the problem is. So you just don't have to think about any of this if you just plug in straight into an amp. But if you plug in into your interface, you have to think about it. The quality of the DI, the length of the whole chain. Short cables are always a great idea, also with real amps. But just the whole quality of the chain before the interface just makes a difference. And that could be what like makes you think amp sims are not as great. It might be the problem might be before the amp sim.
Yep.
One thing that I think you should try is you can, and that's also a thing you can only do in the digital world with amp sims. If everything we just said doesn't give you the results that you're going for, try manipulating the DI before it hits the amp sim, because that's the freedom you have in the DAW. You can put whatever plugin you want in front of the amp sim. So if you are missing some of the grit, for example, if you just feel like the amp sounds too clean or too sterile, too digital, or whatever, try a clipper in front of the amp sim. Try a subtle overdrive plugin. Try a compressor. Try whatever you want in front of the amp sim. And all of a sudden, your amp sim might sound grittier, dirtier, might have more mid-range, whatever you feel it's lacking. And that can add to the realism, or what you perceive as real. And that can take away that feeling of like sterile, clean, digital sound.
Yeah, this is the superpower of amp sims, is what you can do before you even hit them. And I love it. I mean, technically this is true of real amps too, because you could do the same before reamping into one. But it's just the convenience factor and the speed of workflow is probably why both Benny and I love these products so much.
Yeah.
Is that it, like, in no time we're going to go through a bunch of different options and find something that works awesome. Where if we were to try to do the same thing with real amps, we'd be at it all day and potentially not have the tool for the job, right? Because that would mean that we have to have a huge library of real amps available to us to try and find the one that does it. And that's not a realistic expectation of your gear. Even if you have 10 amps, which is a lot of amps to have in a room, that takes up a lot of space, and the signal chains to set them all up so you can compare them realistically, there's still a very slim chance that you're going to have the right tool for the job.
Yeah, totally. That's also something that is worth mentioning, and I think that's basically the whole point of this. And the whole, what we're trying to get across is that I think Malcolm and I don't view amp sims or Kempers as something that's supposed to be the exact same thing as as an amp. It's just different tools that have a sound, and we always have the vision and the tone in mind that we want to achieve. We listen to whatever we're using sounds like, and then we try to get that thing to make the sound that we want. No matter if that's real or fake or artificial or whatever, we just try to make it sound the way we want. And once you get over that, and once you do not try to mimic a real thing, it's just another tool that can work just as fine. So if the amp sim is lacking in whatever way, just find a way around that. Just add a plugin in front of it. Just tweak it a little differently. Try experiment with the gain staging. Hit it differently. Do something to make it work, just as you would with a real amp. If you plug into a real amp and you don't immediately like the sound, you start tweaking. You start adding a pedal. You start adding an overdrive, a tube screamer. You start messing with the volume on your guitar, or you're messing with the gain and the relationship between gain and master output and all that. You do that immediately if you use a real amp. Do the same with amp sims, and don't expect it to be the same as a real amp. Just view it as what it is, and try to make it sound as good as you can. And then you will find out that it's just a different way to get there, and that's basically it.
Yeah, really, it's just a matter of speed for me, speed and options. There's no way that I would have the budget for each project I work on to spend days shooting out guitar amps, where in 10 minutes I can shoot out just like dozens of amps. And like this happened recently. A band was like, well, should we compare a couple? I'm like, well, I already did. Well, you were sitting there waiting. I shot out 5 different amps. This one sounds great. We just got to tweak a little from here and we're good.
Yeah.
It's so quick.
So true. Totally. That also is not something lazy or just an easier way. Your projects actually benefit from that, because you can do it immediately while you still have the vision and the inspiration. Like, as soon as you have an idea of what you're going for, you can immediately act on it. But if you have that idea and you first have to patch a lot of things, and you have to warm up the tubes on the amp, and you do all those things that you need to do with a real amp, that moment of inspiration might be gone. You might not even know what you were going for, and like it's. So I think it's also a creative thing, and your songs and the whole record benefits from just being able to move intuitively and fast. And so it's a blessing. It's just a blessing to have those tools, even if it hurts admitting that they are just as good as real expensive things. But it's true, they are just great. So I mean, to sum it up, it was kind of confusing the way we went through this episode, because it's just such a difficult thing to describe, and it's so objective. But just to bring it into an order again. So we have everything that's before the Kemper or the amp sim. So we have the cable. Use a short cable. That's number 1. Then if you're using your interface, that's not so much an issue with the Kemper. If you're using the interface, try using a DI box and shoot it out against your interface's preamp, and see what you like better. Then get the gain staging right, so the level you're sending into the computer. Try to make that, maybe see if your amp sim is like calibrated a certain way. Maybe they even recommend a certain level going in, or just experiment with that.
They probably do.
Yes. Just play around with that. Find the sweet spot. Find the spot where you have the same dynamics, that you get the same dynamics while you play that you would expect from an amp. Then try manipulating the DI, maybe, if that's what you're going for. If you would use a tube screamer in real life, but you don't have one, you want to do that digitally, find either a tube screamer plugin, or just use a clipper or an overdrive, something like that, and see if you like that. Try EQing the DI. If you feel like it's boxy or overly bright or whatever, try EQing the DI, try filtering it before the amp, because that's already makes the amp sim react differently. Try a low cut if you find it's too boomy or woofy or whatever. The DI quality, the way the DI sounds. And then on the amp sim itself, try playing with the low end. That's part of the realism for me, as I said. Try to get rid of the fizz with proper IRs or EQ or EQ, but I would always start with the IR or virtual mic position as well. Some plugins also give you the option to move the mic around. Play with that.
Right.
And while you're doing all of that, stop thinking about it as the real thing. Just view it as what it is, and stop comparing while you're at it. Just try to get the best possible sound out of it. And then once you're done and you did the best you can, then maybe compare if you want to do that. But just use the tool as what it is and find the stuff that's cool about it, eliminate the stuff that's not cool about it, and you will end up with something usable. I'm absolutely sure.
Yeah, definitely. It's not we started this off as like how to make it sound as good as real amps, but it's not even about that. It's just how to get good guitar tone. And you can use these tools or a real amp. It doesn't really matter to us, but you should be able to get the job done with either. And it's a skill to be learned. So if you excel at getting good guitar tones with real amps, then you now need to focus on what you're not good at, which might be getting good guitar tones with amp sims, which is something I should do. I got real amps and Kempers figured out, so now it's time for me to figure out amp
Yeah,
sims.
totally. And you will, because you going into that with the right mindset. You will view it as a different tool. You will play with it until you find out what's cool about it, and then you will make it work. Yep. It's like it's all about that. And with the Kemper, maybe a quick rundown of what you would do or what you would recommend to someone using a Kemper if they're not satisfied with how it sounds.
Yeah, because I think my workflow is pretty tried and true. So first off, plug in a short guitar cable directly into my active DI in my case, or a DI. If you're not tracking a DI, you can just go directly in, but use a short cable still. And we always recommend grabbing a DI. So you might as well grab a DI and then go from the DI into the Kemper. And then that's where you want to absolutely have the Kemper software up on your computer, because you're going to shoot out amps rapid speed kind of thing. So, and as you go with the Kemper, you're going to learn what profiles you like. You'll start having some favorites, and you'll be like, okay, well, this really sounds great. I know that. So you'll have some places you want to start for sure. But I generally ask the client, I'm like, what are we picturing? They're like, Fender kind of tweed. I'm like, okay. And then I've got a Fender kind of like folder I've set up with all my favorite Fender kind of tones. And I'm going to start digging in there. And as they're playing, I'll just like literally rapid fire through them, make little notes in my head of which ones I liked. And then we narrow it down to 3. I'm like, okay, let's try this one. We record it into the song, this one. And then I choose one. And from there, that's when, like, that's the first time I'll start grabbing knobs. Like really it's we've talked about this before, but the difference starts furthest away from the amp as you can. So it's the player first, right? We've talked about that, and picks and strings and stuff like that. We all know that now. And then there's guitar. So the guitar would have already been sorted out, by the way.
Yeah.
And then it's going to be the amp, and not the knobs in the amp. It's going to be the actual amp. So that's what I'm doing when I'm shooting out through different profiles in a Kemper. I'm shooting out different amps essentially, or different setups of amps in some cases. But that's going to make a bigger difference than anything I could do with turning knobs. And then once I've got that right, I really don't have to touch the knobs that much. I go in there, and often for me, there's like a clarity knob inside of the Kemper that's kind of under the hood a little bit, and that will really open up or subdue things in a pretty big way. And that helps with like the realism feel that we're going for. And then, there's not a lot from there. Sometimes I grab a pedal, sometimes I don't. But that's really my workflow, and it should be done in 5 to 10 minutes.
Super cool. I think that I need to say one more thing now, because what you just said with the EQ, and you basically shooting out EQs and you're not messing around with the knobs too much, is also a general great recommendation, I think. And that just got me thinking, that might also be an issue that people have when they use amp sims, because on the one hand, it's cool to have all this extra control in the computer, but on the other hand, maybe people are just over EQing and over processing stuff just because they can when they use amp sims. So they might not find a proper setting and a proper IR and a proper like sim and then just use that. They might find that they might take whatever comes first, or they might shoot out a bunch and a couple, and then they take something that's close to what they're going for, and then they might throw on an EQ or really like boost a lot of stuff or cut a lot of stuff and really butcher the whatever comes out of the sim, and that might actually cause this weird result that they get. So guitar recording in general, I think, is something where the raw recording should be pretty close to what you want to hear on the record. It's not like with drums where you have these raw drums, and then in modern productions they are heavily processed and sound completely different when it's done, because that can happen with drums. I feel like with guitars, you should be much closer after the raw recording.
Yeah.
It shouldn't require tons of EQ to make it work. And if it does, try a different profile, try a different amp sim, try a different IR, whatever. But don't try to achieve it with EQ because it won't work. It will sound weird and artificial, and that might be actually also part of the issue here.
Yeah, guitars don't like EQ, if we're being honest. I mean, it happens all the time, of course, but if I don't have to use it, I'm very happy, and that's what I shoot for. I'm normally not giving up on my amp hunt inside of the Kemper until I feel like I don't have to change it. Like I'm shooting for not having to change it, and it's like, okay, well, that sounds great. We're good. How they play it is going to make a bigger difference than if I add a little top end.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then the final thing here that we've mentioned briefly is the noise issue maybe. So if you're using amp sims or a Kemper, you're likely sitting in front of your screen, your monitors, your computer. So, and I've also seen that a lot online in forums where people were asking about noise issues with amp sims. And I feel like part of that is because they are sitting in front of their gear with maybe like not ideal cables, cheap cables or something. So just try and turn away with your guitar from all the electrical stuff around you. Try increasing the distance because noise in such an environment can really be an issue. So that's just one thing I want to add here. Again, if that's your problem, if you feel like you're getting a lot of noise with amp sims, it might just be that when you're recording, you're standing in the rehearsal room in front of your amp. And when you're recording with amp sims, you're sitting in front of your computer screen. So that will give you a whole other level of noise floor and interferences and everything your pickup's going to pick up. So just try turning in your chair and finding the position where you have the least noise, the least amount of noise.
Right.
Yeah, that's also recommended.
Yeah, if you've got single coil pickups, it's going to be a long day for you.
Oh, yeah. Like, I love the P90 pickups. They are one of my favorite pickups on the planet, but they are so super noisy. You can't use them anywhere near anything electrical. So, yeah. So I think that's it. Kind of confusing, but I think still valuable episode. It's just a hard topic to explain, but I think there is a couple of actionable things in there that you can try. And we just want to encourage you to use those things and don't view the amp sim or the Kemper as the problem, but just the way you're using it. Just accept that and just try to figure it out because you can figure it out. It's not the tools you're having. Like if you have any modern amp sim, it will get the job done.
Yeah, definitely with you.
Cool. That's it. Go to the Facebook community. Let us know your experiences with that, your results or your issues and problems, and maybe we can discuss it further. theselfrecordingband.com/community. See you there.
See you there.
Bye.
Bye.